What if the story that has lulled so many minds to sleep is itself a carefully woven dream? What if the man called Alexander, the Great, the world conqueror, the son of kings and maybe of gods, is not so much a person we know as a shadow projected on the wall of a cavernous past, shaped by hands we will never see? In the pale light before sleep, that thought moves slowly through the room, like a question that has been waiting for years to be asked. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you feel like it, whisper your city and your local time into the comments, so this strange shared night can stretch quietly across the map. He's supposed to be the most famous conqueror in history, yet almost everything about him reaches us through a narrow, flickering channel. The listeners are told that Alexander lived in the 4th century before our era, that he crossed from Europe into Asia, that he shattered an empire and built another on its bones. But when the room is quiet, when the usual noise of certainty fades, another realization appears. No one alive has ever seen a single page written by the man who marched with him, laughed with him, cursed him in the freezing dark. Their testimonies exist only as names and echoes, like the memory of a voice whose words have dissolved. Ancient writers tell us that there were eyewitness accounts. Callisthenes of Olynthus, the historian who followed Alexander and celebrated him, supposedly wrote a court history. Ptolemy, the general who would one day rule Egypt, is said to have composed his own version of the campaigns. There were others: Aristobulus, Nearchus, Onesicritus, authors who stood close enough to smell the dust on the king's boots. Yet the scrolls themselves are gone. What remains are later authors claiming to have read them, to have compared their testimonies, to have chosen what to preserve and what to let fall away. Arrian of Nicomedia, writing nearly 500 years later, speaks calmly of his sources. He tells the reader that he trusts Ptolemy because a king would not lie, or at least not lie about matters of fact. The words sound confident, almost soothing, as if the centuries between the events and the writing did not matter. But under that calmness, there is a strange unease. If Arrian is choosing, if he prefers one voice over another, then something has already been filtered. If Ptolemy had reasons to shape the story, to defend his own role, to justify his own decisions, how can anyone be sure that Alexander's image in those pages is not already retouched? Other accounts, like those of Callistarchus, were judged more sensational, more colourful, perhaps less reliable. Yet it is often from these less trusted traditions that our most vivid scenes emerge. Drunken feasts, sudden outbursts of rage, the killing of friends and rivals in moments of blazing temper. Over time, the harsher, more disturbing images were sometimes sanded down, balanced with noble motives, rational explanations. A listener in the dark might wonder which version is closer to what the soldiers saw in the torchlight, in the smoky haze of real nights long vanished. What does it mean to know a person whose life was written down centuries after he died, by men who served empires very different from his own? The Roman world adored Alexander, studied him, imitated him. Some Roman generals carried his histories with them on campaign, as if they were manuals for glory. But admiration can be its own kind of distortion. In a culture that worshipped power and conquest, would there not be a temptation to polish away the doubts, to make the story of the Macedonian king into a clean, shining model, a mirror for imperial ambition? There is another layer of silence too. Even if those original accounts had survived, they would have been written from within his circle, or at least from within the world that his armies had made possible. Where are the Persian chronicles of Alexander's advance, written from the vantage point of cities that heard of him not as a hero, but as a catastrophe on the horizon? Where are the diaries of merchants whose roads were broken by war, of families who watched their sons swallowed by conscription or by resistance. Perhaps they existed. Perhaps they were composed in languages that were less valued by later scribes, copied less often, allowed to crumble or burn. Some scraps appear at the edges. A Babylonian astronomical diary notes the arrival of a foreign king whose name has been identified with Alexander, recording his entry into the city almost as a side comment in a text about the movements of planets. Administrative records from the Achaemenid Empire, written on clay tablets in Elamite or Aramaic, show a world of rations, pay, temple offerings, all the humming ordinary machinery that his conquest interrupted. Yet these documents rarely speak his name directly. They are like distant stars, proof that a larger sky existed around the narrow spotlight of his legend. So much effort has gone into reconstructing his path, modern historians collating Greek and Latin texts, comparing them with inscriptions, excavations, numismatic evidence, the patterns of destruction and rebuilding in old city layers. They can map where his armies likely marched, count the approximate distances, estimate the size of his forces at various stages. But beneath this careful scaffolding is a simple, unsettling fact. The emotional core of his story, his motives, his private fears, the exact words of his commands, are shielded behind generations of rewriting. The listener, if honest, must feel that distance like a cool current under warm bath water. Was he a visionary who dreamed of merging peoples, a brutal opportunist riding the momentum of his father's reforms, or something stranger, a young man whose self-image had been enlarged to mythic scale by those around him from childhood? The surviving sources do not agree. Some emphasize his generosity, his charisma, his ability to inspire loyalty in men who had marched thousands of miles. Others, sometimes the very same writers, hint at a darker undercurrent, paranoia, the killing of those closest to him, an increasing fascination with his own divinity. If those contradictions live inside the few texts we have, what contradictions might have filled the works that were lost? Imagine Callisthenes' history, perhaps once carefully stored in a royal archive, its papyrus turning brittle in some forgotten library, then disappearing in fire or neglect. Imagine Ptolemy's original copy, perhaps handled by generations of scribes in Alexandria, where the breath of the sea and the slow abrasion of time nibbled at the shelves. We hear of the library's later destructions, but we rarely dwell on the quieter, earlier centuries in which decisions were made about what to recopy, what to abbreviate, what to leave behind. Was the disappearance of these texts a random result of decay and accident, or was it a kind of unconscious curation by history itself? Works that seemed less useful, less aligned with the needs of the present, were simply allowed to fade. Others were actively suppressed or condemned. Some scholars have noted that history is too critical of kings, too sympathetic to defeated peoples, or too questioning of official narratives often survived poorly. In that dim space between choice and chance, the memory of Alexander has been framed without our consent. The listener lying awake in the dark might begin to sense a disturbing pattern. The figure at the centre of this monumental historical drama is someone we cannot approach directly. He stands like a statue lit from behind, his edges sharp but his features obscured, carved in a material that has already started to crack. Around him, the voices of those who saw him are muffled, reaching us through the mouths and pens of men who lived long after his bones had turned to dust. If the most celebrated conqueror of antiquity reaches us through such a filtered lens, what does that say about the rest of the past, the countless lives that never had a historian at all? If so many of the original witnesses have been erased, gently or violently, Who is truly responsible for the image of Alexander that floats now in the collective imagination? Somewhere between the silence of the lost scrolls and the eloquence of the surviving ones, a question begins to take shape, quiet and insistent. When we say Alexander, are we invoking a man, or are we whispering the name of a story assembled by others for purposes we no longer remember? The more that shadowy adult figure begins to take form in the mind, the more another absence starts to glow at its centre. The boy behind the legend. If our sources are already thin and fractured for the years of conquest, what does that imply for the quiet, unrecorded seasons before the first battle, before the first coronation? The listener, hovering on the edge of sleep, might feel an odd dissonance. Here is a man whose every stride across Asia has been charted in lines and numbers, yet the paths of his childhood in Macedon are hardly traced at all. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedon, or so the later texts tell. They list the names dutifully, like ingredients in an old recipe. Philip II, his father, the ambitious king who hammered Macedon into a military machine. Olympias, his mother, a princess from Epirus, associated by rumour with snakes, with ecstatic rites, with a fierce, unyielding devotion to her son. The facts look firm when laid out in a line, but when one leans closer, the lines begin to blur. For a child who would one day be called great, there are remarkably few contemporary traces. There are no diaries from the royal nursery, no lesson plans written by early tutors, no crude drawings in his own hand, no childhood letters preserved in wax or clay. Almost everything we think we know about young Alexander comes from writers working centuries after his death, weaving together anecdotes that drifted down through oral tradition, court gossip, political propaganda, and perhaps a handful of documents whose own origins had already been half forgotten. Stories crystallize around him the way frost forms on a window, intricate, beautiful, but fragile. Take his mother, Olympias. Ancient authors like Plutarch describe her as intense, jealous, possibly involved in strange religious practices, perhaps using snakes in her ceremonies to honour Dionysus or other deities. In these stories she becomes more than a queen. She's a kind of priestess of destiny, whispering to her son that he is no ordinary child. Yet none of this comes from her own lips. Her letters, if she wrote them, are gone. The rituals she truly practiced remain unrecorded except by outsiders who might have had reasons to exaggerate, to exoticize, to blame her for later political turmoil. Was she really as dominating, as manipulative as the texts portray, or was she simply a convenient figure to carry larger anxieties about powerful women in royal courts? Then there is the whispered claim that Alexander was not just the son of Philip, but the son of Zeus himself. Plutarch recounts stories of dreams and omens, Olympias dreaming that a thunderbolt struck her womb, Philip seeing a lion carved upon a seal, talk that Zeus Ammon had visited her in serpent form. Such tales are told as if they circulated in Macedon while Alexander was still young, precursors to his later divine pretensions. Yet how many of them were invented or polished after his conquests, retrofitting his childhood with a mythic script that would make his rise feel inevitable? If a boy grows up hearing that he is different, chosen, more than human, how does that shape the inner architecture of his mind? Did Alexander, as a child, lie awake listening to his mother's stories about gods and heroes, feeling himself pulled towards some vast invisible stage? Or were these divine paternity rumours mainly a weapon deployed later by his mother and by others to secure his rank among rival claimants, to shield him from criticism, to argue that his authority came not just from blood but from the sky itself? The sources are too thin to say. They leave a silence where a child's formative nights should be. The figure of Philip, too, arrives through contradiction. On one side, he is the brilliant reformer who reorganized the Macedonian army, introduced the Sarissa phalanx, and expanded his kingdom with ruthless skill. On the other, he's a man whose marriages, political alliances, and lovers created a volatile court, one in which a young prince might feel both privileged and precarious. Stories tell of quarrels between father and son, especially after Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman whose hypothetical sons could threaten Alexander's claim. But were these tensions exaggerated by sources sympathetic to Olympias and Alexander, eager to paint Philip as a rival to his own child's destiny? Into this boiling mixture of rumour and ambition steps another formidable name, Aristotle. The philosopher is said to have tutored Alexander in his youth at Mieza, in a sanctuary of the nymphs, where the prince and a group of companions were instructed in philosophy, science, literature, perhaps medicine and politics. Later tradition loves this image. The greatest philosopher of Greece shaping the greatest conqueror of the age. It is an appealing symmetry, almost too neat. Yet here, again, the fog thickens. What documents survive of that educational program? No direct curriculum, no lecture notes, no early writings by Alexander demonstrating what he learned. Instead, we have scattered remarks, that Aristotle gave him a copy of Homer annotated with his own notes, that Alexander later complained the philosopher had published certain doctrines that should have remained secret, that his interest in geography, zoology, and strange lands might reflect Aristotelian curiosity. These connections are plausible, even poetic, but they rest on inferences and on testimonies written long after both men were gone. Did Aristotle truly instill in him a respect for Greek culture and a belief in the superiority of Hellenic ways, helping to shape the ideological frame of his later empire? Or did later writers project their own philosophical categories backward, pleasing themselves with the thought that conquest had been guided by reason, by ethics, by a structured education, rather than by the more chaotic forces of personality and chance? The prince at Mieza, sitting in the dappled shade listening to a philosopher speak of causes and forms and the soul, is an image that soothes the mind, yet the actual conversations that took place there have evaporated completely. The stories we do have about his youth often carry a heavy symbolic weight, as if each one has been sharpened to serve a purpose. There is the famous taming of the horse Bucephalus, a wild stallion that no one could manage, which the young Alexander supposedly calms by realizing that the animal is frightened of its own shadow. He turns the horse's head toward the sun, removes the terror, and in doing so proves his insight and courage. It is a beautiful scene, rehearsed in countless retellings, but how much of it is memory, and how much is allegory crafted to show that this child could ride even the wildest forces of the world, if only he understood their fears? Another anecdote pictures him as a boy reacting bitterly when he hears of his father's victories, complaining that Philip will leave him nothing to conquer. Is this a preserved moment of genuine youthful frustration, or a later story penned by someone who wanted to portray Alexander as born hungry for conquest, incapable of being satisfied with an ordinary inheritance? In these episodes, he becomes a character in a moral drama, his complexity flattened into instructive lines. Notice, too, who is missing from these tales. We do not hear the voices of his early friends describing his moods, his fears, his small cruelties or sudden kindnesses. We do not have the recollections of servants, nurses, guards, people who might have known him not as a hero but as a restless, flawed boy. The more one listens, the more the silence around his childhood becomes its own kind of presence. It is as if the past has chosen to erase the rough sketch and leave only the finished portrait forever touched up. Perhaps this is not accidental. a later age that revered Alexander as a model of kingship, might have had little interest in preserving stories that showed vulnerability or confusion. A world that needed him as a symbol of unstoppable will might have been uncomfortable with any material that spoke of doubt, of hesitation, of being shaped by others rather than always acting upon them. If so, then the childhood of Alexander the Great has been trimmed and dressed to fit a role, like a young actor pushed onto a stage in a costume he did not entirely choose. As the listener drifts closer to sleep, a gentle unease may linger. Somewhere in ancient Macedon, there once walked a child named Alexander, whose laughter echoed in palace corridors, whose first nightmares left him trembling, whose earliest understanding of himself was stitched together from the stories whispered by adults leaning over his bed. Those nights are gone, those whispers unrecorded. All that remains are the versions that survived long enough to be copied, edited, admired. If the man's later career rests on such a faint, myth-heavy foundation, if even his earliest memories have been overwritten by legend, what exactly was the story he heard about himself while he was still small enough to believe anything? And how far did that invisible script carry him toward the edge of the world? The image of the boy, half myth and half forgotten, grows older in the mind, and sooner than expected the quiet corridors of childhood open onto a hall lit with torches, crowded with wine and music and sharpened glances. If the early years are sealed in a mist of rumour, the threshold to power is lit by a single violent flash, a king collapsing at his own celebration. Yet even here, where blood stains the floor and witnesses stood close enough to smell the iron, the story fractures into conflicting lines, as if the moment itself refused to be remembered in one clear way. Philip II, architect of Macedon's rise, was not supposed to die like that, struck down in 336 BCE at Aegae during the wedding festivities for his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus. It was a time of apparent triumph, Macedon ascendant, Greece subdued, plans in motion for a grand campaign against Persia. The setting sounds almost theatrical, a procession, a crowd, offerings to the gods. Then suddenly, a body on the ground and the cry of a name that would echo through centuries: Alexander. The assassin, Pausanias, was no faceless stranger. He was one of Philip's own bodyguards, a trusted man. Later writers spin webs of explanation around his act. One version tells of personal grievance, of an insult and failure of justice, of a rape allegedly arranged by powerful men near the king, and of Philip's refusal or inability to respond adequately. Another hints at deeper plots, suggesting that Pausanias may have been used as a tool by others who wanted the king gone. The problem is not that we have no explanations, but that we have too many, layered with bias and afterthought. Into this fissure of uncertainty, familiar figures step forward like silhouettes: Olympias, Alexander, rival clans within the Macedonian elite, even whispers of Persian agents. Some ancient authors suggest that Olympias may have encouraged Pausanias, or at least welcomed the result. She had reasons to fear Philip's new marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noble whose children could claim a more pure local lineage than Alexander, the son of an Epirot queen burdened with rumours of strange rites and foreign gods. After Philip's death, Olympias reportedly celebrated with unsettling zeal, erecting monuments, possibly even indulging in symbolic revenge against Cleopatra and her infant. Were these stories true, or were they embroidered later to fit a familiar narrative of the dangerous, scheming queen? The texts that accuse her were written in worlds shaped by deep suspicion of powerful women. To blame a mother, to make her the secret hand behind a king's downfall, satisfied old anxieties and provided a clear villain. Yet the alternative, a purely random act of personal revenge at the most significant political moment of Philip's life, seems oddly convenient in a different way. How likely is it that a single humiliated bodyguard, acting entirely alone, chose exactly that place and time? Alexander too has been drawn into the circle of suspicion, though more cautiously. Some later accounts hint that he might have known something, or at least benefited immediately. He was, after all, the principal heir whose position had recently been made precarious by Philip's new marriage. A sudden removal of the king solved many of his problems at once, and his reaction after the assassination was swift, decisive, lethal. Yet here, historians tread carefully, not just out of respect for the legendary conqueror, but because there is no clear evidence, only the eerie symmetry of timing and outcome. What can be observed more clearly is what followed. In the days and weeks after Philip's death, Macedon did not collapse into chaos. Instead, a young man in his early 20s moved rapidly to secure the throne. Alexander ensured that the assassin was killed on the spot, silencing the one person who might have spoken about motives or accomplices. Convenient, some might say, though in that tumultuous moment such an execution could also be seen as a predictable response to regicide. Still, the one voice that might have complicated the story was gone within heartbeats. Then came the quieter, more systematic work, the removal of rivals. There were other potential claimants to the throne, including Amyntas, the son of Philip's dead brother, and any hypothetical children that might emerge from Philip's new marriage. The record here is scattered, but it points toward a series of deaths that do not feel entirely accidental. Some were executed openly, others seem to have vanished in the murk of political necessity. Later sources mention the fate of Cleopatra Eurydice and her child, with disturbing hints of coercion and death, actions often attributed to Olympias, but occurring under the shadow of Alexander's rising power. A listener in the dark might ask, where in this sequence of events does justice end and self-preservation begin? In the logic of ancient monarchies, such eliminations were often described as inevitable. A new king could not afford to leave viable rivals alive, lest factions coalesce around them and tear the kingdom apart. Yet the language of necessity can become a mask, a soft cloth placed over the face of more brutal ambitions. Did Alexander mourn the world his father had hoped to build, or did he feel, beneath the shock, the grim relief of a door suddenly opening? When historians piece together this transition, they rely on sources that themselves were shaped by the regimes that followed. Later Macedonian and Hellenistic authors had reasons to present Alexander's accession as smooth, lawful, almost preordained. The messier possibility that he rose through a mixture of chance, manipulation, and targeted violence sits uneasily with the later cult of the world conqueror. Thus some deaths are mentioned only in passing, some motives are left unexplored, some names appear once and then are gone forever, like sparks that never grow into flame. Notice how quickly alternative futures for Macedon are extinguished in these narratives. A different son of Philip might have ruled, changing the focus from Asia to consolidation at home. A child of Cleopatra, Eurydice, might have inherited a more traditional inward-looking kingdom. Amyntas might have revived another branch of the royal line. Each possibility represents a path history might have taken, and each was closed off one by one in the shadows of the royal house. There must have been conversations, pleas, perhaps even last-minute bargains offered and refused. Yet the texts are largely silent. They record outcomes, not the trembling that preceded them. It is here that the idea of erasure begins to feel more than metaphorical. When a new regime takes power, it often rewrites not only laws and boundaries, but the story of how it came to be. Inscriptions are commissioned, Coins are minted, official histories are shaped to suggest continuity, legitimacy, a sense that all of this was meant to happen. Events that might cast doubt on that impression are pushed to the margins or explained away or laid at the feet of convenient scapegoats. In Macedon, after Philip's assassination, how many documents were quietly destroyed, how many testimonies discouraged, how many witnesses taught to forget? Archaeology can recover fragments of buildings and graves from this period, but it rarely speaks clearly about motives. A tomb might show signs of haste or luxury. A burial might suggest status or disgrace. Scholars argue over the identification of certain royal tombs at Vagina, debating which bones belong to whom, whether traces of violent support or contradict the literary accounts. But even when a skeleton tells of trauma, it does not whisper who ordered it, or why particular deaths were deemed unavoidable. If the story of Alexander's childhood is fogged with myth, the story of his first days as king is edged with the sharp outlines of power and fear. He emerges from the swirl of mourning, processions and executions as the undisputed ruler of Macedon, poised to inherit Philip's plans for an Asian campaign. The transition appears clean on the surface, efficient, almost seamless. Underneath, there must have been a long, tremulous night in which people waited to see which names would be called, which doors would be opened gently, and which would be struck down. For the listener half asleep, the question becomes uneasy and personal. When a new order is born in such a way, with so many alternative voices silenced at the beginning, how much of what follows can we trust as unfiltered truth, and how much is the carefully curated memory of those who survived and prospered under the victorious king? Somewhere in that first harvest of lives and possibilities, in those hurried decisions about who might live to tell the tale and who must vanish, did the story of Alexander the Great already begin to detach from the messy reality beneath it, drifting toward the polished legend that would travel through centuries? By the time the dust of Macedon had settled round his feet, the horizon had already shifted. The palace corridors, with their whispered intrigues and sudden disappearances, opened outward into something vaster, a narrow strip of water, a line on the map that older poets had filled with ghosts. Yet even this crossing, often recited as the clear beginning of Alexander's true story, carries its own fractures, its own quiet evasions. The listener, suspended between waking and sleep, might sense that each step he takes toward Asia is also a step away from anything we can verify with certainty. The Hellespont, that strait between Europe and Asia Minor, is described in later texts as a threshold more symbolic than geographical. Arrian tells of Alexander leaping ashore in Asia and casting a spear into the soil, claiming the land as spear-won territory. Other accounts dwell on his visit to the plains of Troy, where he is said to have honoured Achilles, running around the hero's supposed tomb or laying a wreath there. These moments are narrated with solemn reverence, as if he were consciously stepping into a ready-made script, modelling himself on Homeric warriors. Yet one cannot help but notice how closely this pattern fits the desires of those who retold it. The philosopher's pupil becoming the new Achilles, with Asia cast as a stage for reenacting epic glory. Did he truly believe himself a reincarnated hero? Or were these gestures calculated performances for his army, and the Greek cities watching from afar? Our sources, again, disagree or simply gloss over the question. Some emphasize his genuine emotional engagement with Homer's text, describing how he supposedly kept an annotated copy by his side. Others hint that the comparison to Achilles was as much a political tool as a personal obsession, a way of speaking to men raised on the same stories. Either way, the narratives agree on the effect. The crossing was framed not merely as expansion, but as a continuation of a myth older than any of the soldiers who followed him. From this charged beginning, the first major clash in Asia comes at the river Granicus. Here too the waters are muddied. Different ancient authors give different troop numbers, different arrangements of forces, even different positions for the river crossing itself. Some claim that Alexander, impatient and defiant, led a frontal assault across the stream, risking everything in a dramatic surge against Persian cavalry waiting on the far bank. Others suggest a more cautious strategy, with a surprise attack at dawn or a crossing at a less guarded point. The battle that is often depicted as his first dazzling victory in Asia thus dissolves, on closer inspection, into a collage of incompatible details. Why do these accounts diverge so sharply? Part of the answer lies in perspective. Ptolemy, Aristobulus, Cleitarchus, and their successors wrote with different audiences and agendas in mind. A bold, reckless charge might highlight Alexander's bravery and divine favour. A more measured manoeuvre would demonstrate his prudence and generalship. Over time, as historians tried to reconcile these versions, they smoothed over contradictions or chose the one that best suited their image of the king. The listener in the quiet room might feel a subtle tug. How many of the battlefield's shouts, hesitations and near failures have simply been edited out? Even the Persian side of the Granicus is strangely muted. We know some names of the satraps and commanders who faced him, but their motives, their disagreements, their fears are barely sketched. Did they argue about whether to meet him at the river or fall back to more defensible terrain? Did they underestimate the resolve of this young Macedonian, assuming his advance was just another raid to be repelled? The Greek and Macedonian sources, focused on their own hero, rarely pause to imagine the inner life of the opposing camp. An entire world of calculation and dread is implied, yet left largely unspoken. After Granicus, cities in Asia Minor begin to fall or to open their gates. Sardis, Miletus, Halicarnassus. Here, modern historians can sometimes trace the outlines of sieges and negotiations through inscriptions and archaeological layers, scorched ruins, hurried repairs. But the narrative attention of ancient authors moves quickly, as if eager to hurry past the complex, grinding work of subduing fortified places and reorganizing administration. They prefer to dwell on the brighter flare of set-piece battles, the moments when Alexander's personal presence was most visible. The long bureaucratic shadows that followed his victories are seldom explored with equal care. Then comes Issus, another river, another recomposed scene. Darius III, the great king of Persia, finally appears in person at the head of a large army. Once again, the numbers swell and shrink depending on the author. Some give Persian forces in the hundreds of thousands, others in more plausible tens of thousands, all filtered through rhetorical habits that equated mass with majesty. The geography of the battle, a narrow coastal plain hemmed in by mountains and sea, complicates matters further. How could such immense numbers have manoeuvred there at all? Scholars debate, propose reconstructions, adjust troop estimates downward. The ancient narratives, meanwhile, continue to speak of a small Macedonian force defeating a much larger host, the classic tale of courage defying odds. The pattern is familiar. Alexander appears at the critical juncture, rallying his companions, driving toward the point where Darius is believed to stand. Darius, seeing the tide turn, flees the field in his chariot, leaving behind not only soldiers but family members and treasures. It is a story that flatters the victor and diminishes the defeated, wrapping messy circumstances in a clear moral. Boldness triumphs, royal cowardice fails. Yet here again, the Persian voice is all but absent. How did Darius later explain this retreat to his own court? What accounts circulated in Babylon, Susa, or Persepolis about this young king from the west who had broken one imperial army but not yet shattered the empire itself? Scraps hint at another side. Babylonian astronomical diaries and administrative texts suggest disruptions in the normal order, noting battles, eclipses, troop movements as omens or background events in a larger cosmic rhythm. In such records, Alexander is reduced to a foreign king whose arrival shifts the pattern of offerings and taxes. The grandeur of Macedonian victory as sung by Greek authors shrinks into a marginal note beside calculations of grain and silver. Two realities coexist: the blazing exemplar of heroic conquest and the mundane shock to systems that had measured time and value in a different currency for generations. It is easy, drifting towards sleep, to picture this period as a smooth, unstoppable advance. Hellespont, Granicus, Issus, each step inevitable, each victory preordained by some script of destiny. Yet the fractures in our sources suggest a more fragile chain. Weather, terrain, miscommunication, the moods of soldiers, the particular choices of local elites deciding whether to resist or submit, all of these must have played a role, though they rarely leave a clean trace in the texts. The neat arcs we inherit are, in part, the product of narratives that needed to make sense of chaos. Each victory, as preserved in our surviving accounts, carries a hidden cost in perspective. As Alexander's legend grows, the Persians seem to thin out, becoming less a people with their own memories and more a background against which Macedonian brilliance can stand in relief. The Achaemenid administrative tradition, which once recorded the life of an empire in thousands of clay tablets, is barely allowed to speak in this story. Its archives, scattered or destroyed, its languages increasingly sidelined by Greek, sink slowly beneath the surface of later Hellenistic culture. Standing at the edge of the Hellespont, he may have believed he was stepping into history. In truth, he was also stepping onto the ruins of earlier histories, written in scripts and tongues that his followers would rarely bother to preserve. The listener, lying in the dark, can almost hear two kinds of silence at once. The silence of what was never recorded about these campaigns, and the deeper silence of what was recorded in other traditions, then lost, burned, or simply left to crumble. If the story of Alexander's crossing into Asia has come down as a clear line of triumph, how much of that clarity is the result of later smoothing, careful selection, and the quiet disappearance of voices that would have told the same events from another shore? Somewhere after the noise of battle at Issus, after the chariots turned and the dust began to settle, the story of Alexander takes on a new kind of glow, one that is less about the clash of armies and more about the slow, deliberate crossing of thresholds inside palaces and memory. It is in this dim interior space that the listener finds him at Persepolis, the fabled heart of the Achaemenid court, standing among columns like petrified trees, surrounded by art and archives, and holding, perhaps without fully knowing it, the fragile threads of a world's written soul in his hands. Persepolis was never just a city. It was a ceremonial centre, a stage on which the great king of Persia performed his role before ambassadors from every corner of the empire. Reliefs carved along stairways and terraces show delegations bringing tribute, fabrics, animals, vessels, weapons, all rendered in orderly procession, each figure distinct yet folded into a larger rhythm. Archaeologists, brushing dust from those stones in the modern era, have marvelled at the precision, the calm. But when Alexander entered Persepolis in 330 BCE, he did not come as a respectful envoy. He came as a conqueror walking through the heart chambers of a rival civilization. Ancient accounts speak of treasure piled up there beyond imagining. Gold, silver, luxuries stored over generations, the distilled wealth of provinces from Egypt to India. They also speak more faintly of archives. Clay tablets written in Elamite, Aramaic, Old Persian, perhaps other languages, lists of workers, rations, offerings, supplies, records of construction and ceremony. Some of these tablets have been excavated in our time from the ruins of Persepolis, their cuneiform lines still legible after more than 2 millennia. They show an empire that ran not just on royal proclamations, but on mundane, precise accounting. Yet the scale of what was once stored there, and what has vanished, is something we can only guess. The sources tell us that Alexander at first treated Persepolis as a prize to be claimed. He allowed his troops to plunder, though some say he tried to keep the worst excesses under control. He reportedly sat on the great king's throne, perhaps awkwardly, perhaps savouring the symbolism. He stayed there for a time, long enough for routine to set in, for banquets to be held, for intoxication to creep in around the edges. The city's palaces, with their reliefs and inscriptions, must have felt like a museum of a still-living order, one that now lay at his feet. And then, one night, a fire. Here the narratives diverge with unnerving energy. Plutarch describes a drunken revel, a courtesan named Thais, possibly Athenian, proposing that they burn the royal palace as revenge for Xerxes' destruction of Athens nearly 150 years earlier. Alexander, warmed by wine and encouraged by those around him, supposedly leapt up, seized a torch, and led the way, igniting the wooden structures that crowned the stone. Terraces. The flames spread quickly, leaping from roof to roof, devouring beams and painted ceilings. In this telling, the act is impulsive, theatrical, almost ritualistic, a symbolic closing of one chapter of Greek humiliation and the opening of another, more triumphant one. Other authors suggest something cooler and more unsettling, that the burning was not merely a drunken caprice, but a calculated decision, at least partially deliberate, to cripple the symbolic heart of the Achaemenid dynasty. Arrian preserves a tradition that Alexander later regretted the act, seeing it as a barbaric deed unworthy of him, perhaps done under the influence of wine and bad counsel. This expression of remorse has often been used to highlight his supposed self-control and civilizing mission. Yet even this regret, if it existed, comes to us filtered through later interpretations of what a good conqueror ought to feel. Modern scholars argue about the extent of the destruction. Not all of Persepolis was burned. Some structures survived, some were merely damaged. The famous reliefs on the Apadana staircases still show delegations bearing gifts. They were not wholly erased. The fire seems to have been both catastrophic and selective, consuming large portions of the palatial complex but leaving enough for archaeologists to reconstruct. Still, for the archives stored there, the distinction may not have mattered. Papyrus, parchment, wooden tablets, anything that could bear ink or paint, would have been acutely vulnerable to flame. Imagine, in the moments before the fire took hold, shelves of documents representing decades of imperial administration, the quiet heartbeat of an empire that had stretched across continents, lists of rations for workers building those very halls, notices of temple offerings, decrees about land and labour, correspondence between officials, an entire network of bureaucratic memory suddenly exposed to sparks. How many voices were fixed in those lines? How many local names, regional customs, minor disputes, forgotten in an instant as heat turned careful marks into smoke? The surviving Persepolis fortification and treasury tablets, preserved by burial under debris and discovered in the 20th century, offer just a fragmentary glimpse. They have revealed details about the Achaemenid economy, religious practices, multilingual administration, the presence of women in the workforce, the logistics of feeding and housing workers and animals. Scholars who decipher these tablets often speak with a kind of reverence, as if touching the pulse of a world that otherwise would be known only from the Greek and later sources that often caricatured it. If this small cache changes our understanding so much, what might have been contained in the records that burned that night? Was the fire at Persepolis an act of revenge, a political statement, a lapse into destructive spectacle, or a clumsy mixture of all three? If Alexander wanted to present himself as the successor to the great kings, burning their ceremonial centre seems like a strange choice. Yet if he still thought of himself as a Greek avenger, punishing Persia for past invasions, the gesture could be read as a final, dramatic answer to Xerxes. The trouble is that our sources, shaped by later agendas, hand us these motives in neat packages, as if a single explanation could cover all the layers of impulse and pressure at work in that night's decision. There is also the quieter possibility that the burning, whatever its initial spark, provided a convenient opportunity to erase certain aspects of the old order that did not fit easily into the narrative of his emerging empire. Archives that testified to the complexity and resilience of the Achaemenid state, that documented loyalties, tax arrangements, and temple privileges, might have complicated efforts to impose new systems and new loyalties. A conqueror who wished to rule in continuity might preserve such records. One who wished to reframe the story might be less careful. No explicit ancient source accuses Alexander of burning Persepolis in order to destroy its archives. That interpretation belongs to modern speculation, piecing together what fire does in fragile environments. Perhaps the blaze truly was a drunken excess, regretted in the sober light of day, with no premeditated archival intent. And yet, to someone lying awake in the dark, the result is the same. A vast accumulation of memory, much of it never to be read again, curling into blackness while music still echoes in the halls above. If the Library of Alexandria later became a symbol of lost knowledge, Persepolis might be seen as an earlier, less often lamented wound in the fabric of recorded time. The difference is that we have grown used to telling Alexander's story as if this wound were incidental, a dramatic flourish in the middle of his career, rather than a decisive rupture in the documentation of a previous world. The light of his legend shines so brightly that the darkness it casts over what came before is rarely considered in full. The listener might wonder, when a civilization's central symbols and records burn under the gaze of a new ruler, how much of what we later call history is quietly realigned in that heat? Are we heirs to the perspectives of those who lit the torches and walked away? Or do echoes of the burned word still tremble somewhere beneath our inherited narratives, waiting for someone to notice their absence? In the smoky silence after Persepolis, with charred beams still warm and ashes drifting through the palace air, did Alexander understand what had been lost, or did he sleep that night believing only that another obstacle had been theatrically removed from his path? Long after the embers of Persepolis had cooled into a memory that smelled faintly of smoke, another kind of desert waited, not of fire but of sand and sky and echoing shrines. Between the blackened ruins of an empire he'd helped to burn and the green ribbon of the Nile, Alexander's story bends in a quieter arc. A young king stepping into Egypt, greeted as a liberator guided toward a lonely oracle at the edge of the known world. It is here that his reflection in the mirror of history shifts again, as if someone has dimmed one lantern and lit another behind him. To the Greek cities along the coast, Egypt might have felt familiar. Buzzing harbours, old stories of Herodotus, tales of priests and pyramids, a land of measured floods and ancient ritual. To Alexander, arriving in 332 BCE after the siege of Tyre and the submission of Gaza, it was something else as well, a stage on which he was swiftly reframed, no longer just a Macedonian king or a Greek avenger, but a pharaoh, a son of gods in a language he did not yet speak. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, seem to have received him with little resistance. Our sources describe him entering Memphis, making sacrifices to local deities, participating in ceremonies that signalled acceptance by the priestly elite. Greek and later authors, who love to see in this a kind of natural harmony between Hellenic and Egyptian worlds, present it almost as a smooth embrace. But missing from most accounts is the perspective of villagers along the Nile who had already seen foreign rulers come and go, whose fields had been taxed by one empire after another. Did they hear in the proclamations about this new king any promise different from those that had preceded him? Or did they simply adjust, as they always had, to another distant name on the official seals? Amid these formalities, one decision stands out: Alexander's journey westward to the oasis of Siwa to consult the oracle of Ammon. The very route was unusual. Instead of lingering in the fertile heartland, he pushed into the Libyan desert, following paths that caravans and local guides knew, but which lay outside the usual circuits of conquerors. Later writers paint the journey as half pilgrimage, half test, emphasizing the dangers of the desert. Dunes that swallowed tracks, sudden storms, the risk of losing wells. Some embroidered versions speak of miraculous guides, birds or serpents or divine signs leading him onward. Whether or not such wonders were ever claimed at the time, their presence in the tradition shows how easily the desert becomes a canvas for projection. What did he hope to hear at Siwa? The oracle of Ammon, whom the Greeks associated with Zeus, offered answers in a synthesis of Egyptian and Libyan religious practice. Herodotus, writing before Alexander's time, had already mentioned the oracle's prestige. For a king who was increasingly entangled in ideas of divine favour and heroic lineage, a pronouncement from such a shrine could be more than personal reassurance. It could be a tool to solidify authority over diverse subjects. A god's words, properly advertised, travel farther than any army. Yet when we try to listen in on that fateful consultation, we find only muffled, distorted echoes. Ancient authors report that the oracle greeted him as son of Zeus, or as child of Ammon. But even these quotations are suspiciously neat. We do not know in what language the priest spoke, whether Greek, Egyptian, or something in between, and how the meanings were filtered through translators, courtiers, later historians. One report suggests that the priest stumbled over a phrase, meaning to say, "O Paidion, my child," and instead uttering something like, "O Pai Dios, child of Zeus," a slip that could be seized upon by those eager to magnify his status. Was this a genuine linguistic accident, or a retroactive explanation invented to rationalize a proclamation that some found uncomfortable? Plutarch mentions that Alexander asked secret questions to which only he and the god knew the answers, and that he was satisfied, though the content of these mysteries is never revealed. Other sources hint that he inquired about his father's killer, or his own divine paternity. The vagueness is telling. Oracles in the ancient world were famous for their ambiguity, for phrasing responses in ways that could be read in multiple directions depending on unfolding events. By the time Arrian and others were writing, the outcome was already known. Alexander had conquered widely, died young, and been remembered as extraordinary. Any story about Siwa could be retrofitted to cast his ascent as pre-sanctioned by the gods. The listener in the dark might wonder, if a prophecy is recorded only after it appears to have come true, is it a prediction or simply a backdated caption written under a finished painting? There is also the matter of what was not recorded. Siwa had its own local traditions, its own priests and cult practices, most of which remain obscure. How did they interpret the visit of this foreign king? Did they see in him a figure to be flattered for practical reasons, a potential patron to replace older powers, or did some among them sense a deeper rupture in their sacred patterns? No texts survive from their perspective about that visit. The story of the oracle at Siwa has reached us almost entirely through Greek and Roman voices, fascinated by the idea that their own Zeus Ammon had recognized a mortal as his son. If the scene at the shrine is veiled in ambiguity, the consequences are somewhat clearer. After Siwa, reports of Alexander's divine status became more pronounced. Some of his followers began to treat the title Son of Zeus Ammon with increasing seriousness, at least in public. Later, in the eastern parts of his empire, he would experiment with forms of royal protocol that suggested semi-divine elevation, blurring the line between man and god in ways that made some Macedonian companions uneasy. Did Siwa give him a new certainty about who he was, or simply provide a convenient religious stamp for ambitions that were already forming? Back in Egypt, another more tangible act of self-definition took place: the founding of Alexandria. Unlike the remote sanctuary at Siwa, this was a coastal gesture, a mark scratched into maps and trade routes. The traditional story has him choosing the site by the sea, near the canopic mouth of the Nile, guided by strategic considerations. A harbour with good shelter, proximity to the river's wealth, a position connecting Mediterranean routes to the interior. An omen is said to have confirmed the choice. The shape of the planned city, traced in barley flour, immediately swarmed by birds, which the seers interpreted as a sign of future prosperity and global attraction. Alexandria soon became more than a harbour. Under the Ptolemies, successors of Alexander in Egypt, it would grow into a centre of scholarship, home to the famous library in the Macedon, where texts from across the known world were collected, copied, translated and arranged. In that later flowering, some have seen an echo, perhaps even a realization, of a dream attributed to Alexander, a cosmopolitan city where Greek and Egyptian and other cultures mingled, where knowledge itself would be curated under royal patronage. But here too the evidence is layered and uncertain. We have no direct writings from Alexander outlining a detailed cultural program for Alexandria. The idea that he consciously intended a city of knowledge and fusion may owe as much to later Ptolemaic ideology as to anything he personally envisioned. Founders are attractive canvases. It is easy to project backward the mature institutions of a city onto the moment of its naming, to picture the young conqueror already imagining shelves of scrolls and debates among philosophers. What is more concrete is that Alexandria became a place where the flow of information could be controlled. Royal decrees governed which texts were copied, which ships' cargoes of books were temporarily seized and duplicated, which scholars received patronage. Over time, this created a hierarchical landscape of knowledge, with Greek language and frameworks often placed at the centre, and older local traditions mediated or reinterpreted through Hellenistic lenses. The very act of translation into Greek, while preserving some content, also reshaped meanings, trimmed nuances tethered to sacred terms in Egyptian or other tongues. Standing between Siwa and Alexandria, between oracle and archive, Alexander's Egyptian episode reads like a pivot. On one side, the murky announcement of divine sonship through a voice we cannot quite hear. On the other, the first sketch of a city that would one day claim authority over memory itself. In both cases, a pattern emerges. Sanctuaries and libraries, oracles and catalogues are pulled into the orbit of power. The god's words and the scholar's texts begin to revolve around a single name. If the desert shrine at Siwa did indeed whisper something into Alexander's ear about his nature and destiny, that whisper has been amplified, filtered, and distorted by centuries of repetition. If the foundations of Alexandria mark the beginning of a new era of organized knowledge, they also signaled a subtle narrowing, a decision about which languages and perspectives would be given pride of place on the shelves. For the listener drifting towards sleep, a thought stirs like wind through papyrus reeds. when a single life becomes both the axis of divine pronouncements and the measure by which libraries arrange their contents, how much of what survives to us has already bent, almost imperceptibly, in his direction? And in that bending, quiet but pervasive, how many older, stranger ways of understanding the world have slid softly out of view, leaving us to dream in a house of knowledge whose foundations were poured while the sand of Siwa still held the fading footprints of a king listening for a god's uncertain voice? By the time Egypt had folded itself behind him like a page turned in a dimly lit book, something in Alexander's story had shifted from centre to periphery. The bright, familiar world of the Aegean and the Nile receded, and the map ahead became less detailed, more speculative, full of names that in Greek ears sounded both alluring and indistinct. Bactria, Sogdiana, the lands beyond the Oxus and Jaxartes, and somewhere further still, the places that would later be called India. As the line of march stretched eastward, the sources that describe it begin to thin, like ink running out. Historians still trace the campaigns in outline. After Gaugamela and the pursuit of Darius III, after Babylon and Susa and the final broken remnants of Achaemenid resistance, Alexander did not stop. He drove his armies into the highlands and river valleys of Central Asia, where local powers, satraps and tribal leaders tried to adapt, resist, or accommodate in ways that only faintly register in the Greek and Roman texts. Names such as Bessus, Spitamenes, Roxana appear, like isolated stars in a night sky whose constellations we no longer know how to read. Bessus, a satrap who seized Darius and eventually claimed the royal title for himself, is remembered primarily as a traitor, the man who betrayed his king, then was hunted down and executed by Alexander in an act framed as righteous vengeance. Yet from another angle he could be seen as a regional figure trying to salvage some continuity of Persian authority in the face of collapse. The sources that call him a usurper belong to the tradition that accepted Alexander's conquest as the new axis of legitimacy. What would a Bactrian chronicle, if it had survived, have said about him, or about the strange foreign king who judged his loyalty and found it wanting? Spitamenes, who led a fierce, prolonged resistance in Sogdiana, flickers into view through brief references to ambushes and reversals, to Macedonian detachments cut down far from the main force. His campaigns forced Alexander into years of hard fighting, far from the grand-pitched battles that fill so many pages of earlier narratives. It was a war of raids, fortresses, shifting alliances, hardly the kind of struggle that lends itself to neat heroic scenes. Not surprisingly, the literary tradition compresses it, tidies it, reduces it to obstinacy finally overcome, resistance that simply had to be broken on the way to a more important destiny. And yet those years in Bactria and Sogdiana seem to mark a change in the tenor of the campaign. The sources hint at frustration, at the strain on troops who may have expected to return west after the fall of the Persian heartland, only to find themselves chasing elusive enemies through harsh terrain. Alexander's methods grow harsher in turn: mass deportations, the planting of garrisons, the forced resettlement of populations. At the same time, his policies toward the local elite become more entangled. He marries Roxana, a noblewoman from the region, and begins to integrate local cavalrymen and nobles into his command structure more aggressively. Was this a vision of fusion, of a new blended ruling class, or merely a pragmatic strategy to stabilize a region that refused to be pacified by force alone? Arrian and others, looking back, sometimes attribute to Alexander a grand design of unity of mankind, a plan to create a mixed Greco-Asian aristocracy. Yet this language owes much to later idealization. On the ground, what his officers and soldiers felt was likely more immediate. Foreign customs imposed on them, unfamiliar dress codes, marriages encouraged or ordered, a sense that the boundaries of their old Macedonian identity were being stretched for reasons they may not have fully trusted. The famous episode at Opis, where mutiny flared among Macedonian veterans who resented the promotion of Persian and other Eastern troops, shows how fraught this experiment had become. The speeches ascribed to Alexander in the sources, in which he rebukes his men and reminds them of his generosity, sound polished, theatrical, shaped by rhetorical training. Whether he apologized, raged, or wept, the underlying tension remains, a king moving toward an idea of empire that outran the emotional loyalties of many who had followed him from home. From Central Asia, the path bends southeast toward the Indus. Here, the narrative loses even more of its symmetry. Greek and Roman authors refer to Indian cities and rulers through names filtered and bent by language: Taxila, Paurava, Porus. They speak of the Indus Valley, of elephants, of strange customs, but often with a gaze more curious than careful. Their knowledge of the subcontinent's political landscape was fragmentary at best, pieced together from local informants, interpreters, and the impressions of soldiers passing through. We know Alexander met with Taxils, a ruler who chose alliance rather than resistance, offering support against his rival, the king whom Greek sources call Porus. At the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, that rivalry drew the Macedonians into one of the most challenging battles of the Eastern campaign. The accounts of Hydaspes are vivid: the swollen river, the monsoon rains, the night crossing upstream while Porus watched the obvious fords, the elephants looming in the mist like living walls. Yet even here, where our sources linger more than usual, questions pile up. The exact size of Porus's forces, the deployment of elephants, the depth of Macedonian losses, all are uncertain. The narratives emphasize Alexander's tactical skill, his feigned maneuvers and flanking march, his personal courage in leading the cavalry. They also highlight something rarer: his respect for Porus. After defeating him, the tradition has Alexander asking how he wishes to be treated, and Porus replying, "like a king," a phrase that has been repeated, polished, and admired for centuries. Is this exchange a preserved memory or a constructed emblem, a way for later authors to represent Alexander as a magnanimous conqueror who could recognize greatness even in an enemy? Indian traditions about these events, fragmentary and hard to correlate with Greek timelines, sometimes present different emphases, treating the invader not as a destined world ruler, but as one more transient threat overcome or absorbed into a much longer local history. Between these parallel stories, yawning gaps remain. Perhaps the most haunting hinge in this Eastern arc is not a battle, but a refusal. After Hydaspes, as Alexander pushed further toward the Hyphasis River, his army reached a limit that was not geographical but human. The sources agree that the soldiers, exhausted by years of campaigning, drenched by unfamiliar rains, unnerved by stories of even greater powers and vast armies further east, refused to march on. They had, in their view, reached the edge of the world that mattered, and no promise of further glory could compensate for the fatigue and fear that had seeped into their bones. The scene at the Hyphasis, as described by Arrian and others, is suffused with speeches. Alexander urging, cajoling, invoking their shared past, the troops answering through their spokesman Conus, pleading for a return, for the chance to see their homes again before death claimed them far away. As always, the words placed in their mouths are crafted by later pens, shaped by Greek rhetorical expectations. Still, through the stylization, one senses something raw. The moment when the will of one man, however exalted, finally met the resistance of many. He withdrew, reluctantly, performing sacrifices to the gods and interpreting omens as a justification for turning back, as if even his own retreat needed to be wrapped in the language of divine approval. But what truly lay behind that decision? Religious awe, political calculation, or the simple recognition that an army that will not move forward is no longer an instrument of conquest, but a mirror of its leader's limits? In the stories that grew later around Alexander, especially in the so-called Alexander Romance, this eastern edge became a place of wonders, talking trees, prophetic beasts, cities under the sea, gates built against apocalyptic tribes. These tales, only loosely connected to historical events, testify to a lingering sense that beyond the point where his army stopped, the world slid into myth. Even serious ancient writers sometimes report rumours of distant Indian states, of enormous rivers and mountains, of wisdom traditions older than Greek philosophy, but they offer them as hearsay, not experience. The frontier between what Alexander had touched and what lay beyond remained porous but unresolved. For the listener sinking towards sleep, a curious thought may stir. As the king pushed his men toward lands their maps barely sketched, did he sense that his own story was beginning to outrun the ability of any one tradition to contain it? Each step eastward multiplied the number of local narratives that could, in principle, have been told about his passage. In Aramaic, in Old Persian, in Bactrian dialects, in early forms of the languages of the Indus. How many of those accounts were never written down, or were inscribed on perishable materials that dissolved in monsoon air and desert wind? If at the western edges of his life the problem is that we see him only through the lens of later admiration, then here, at the outer rim of his journeys, the problem is almost the opposite. Vast regions of response and memory lie beyond the reach of the texts we possess. The further he walked from the familiar centres of Greek literacy, the more his image must have splintered into local interpretations that have not survived. Standing at the hyphasis, with rain in his hair and an army that would not be persuaded, did Alexander feel thwarted by the world, or by the limits of human endurance, or by some quieter boundary that separates what can be captured in clean heroic lines from the point where history dissolves into the soft, unrecorded murmur of those who watched him pass and did not write at all? If the refusal at the hyphasis was a wall of will, an invisible boundary drawn by exhausted men, then what followed was a different kind of frontier altogether, a place where the limits did not announce themselves in words, but in sand, thirst, and the quiet collapse of bodies no one would live to describe. As Alexander turned his army back from the edge of India and began the long journey west, the familiar pattern of battles and negotiations gave way to something far less narratable, less heroic, a march into the Gedrosian desert, where the story thins almost to vanishing. The decision itself is unsettling. After campaigns through the Punjab and a bloody struggle against the Malians, after ships had been ordered to sail along the coast under Nearchus, Alexander chose to lead a large portion of his forces and camp followers through Gedrosia, an arid, inhospitable region roughly corresponding to parts of modern Macedon. Greek and Roman authors knew that earlier conquerors, including Cyrus the Great, had suffered disaster there. The warning existed, like a dim light at the edge of memory. Yet he went. Later explanations strain to make sense of this. Some suggest he desired to outdo Cyrus, to succeed where a legendary predecessor had failed, to carve his name into the harshness of the land as proof that no obstacle could resist him. Others point to logistical considerations, arguments about supply routes, the need to coordinate with the fleet. Modern historians debate whether alternative paths were truly viable, whether seasonal conditions made the desert crossing even more brutal than expected. In our surviving ancient texts, however, the motive is never fully pinned down. It is as if the decision stands there bare and impenetrable, a single stroke on the map whose inner logic dissolved with the men who followed it. What happened in Gedrosia is, on the face of it, one of the great calamities of his campaign. Multiple sources agree that a vast number of people died: soldiers, servants, families, animals. They speak of blazing heat, of wells found dry or poisoned, of dunes that swallowed men and baggage alike. There are images of water rationed drop by drop, of whole units lost in sudden storms of sand. Yet for all this, the descriptions are peculiarly thin, almost perfunctory, especially when compared to the loving detail lavished on earlier battles. Arrian, Plutarch, and others note the suffering, but they do not linger over individual stories of despair in the way they narrate the death of a single friend, the fall of a notable officer. The Gedrosian march appears more as a dark band in the timeline, a shadow across which the narrative voice moves quickly, pausing only for one story. The tale of the helmet filled with water, offered to Alexander by loyal soldiers who had strained to collect it, and his choice to pour it out onto the sand rather than drink while others thirsted. It is a powerful scene, and it has been repeated for centuries as proof of his solidarity, his willingness to suffer with his men. But notice what has happened in the telling. The catastrophe of the many has been crystallized into a single, edifying gesture by one man. Thousands of deaths, reduced to the backdrop for a moral anecdote. The desert in this account becomes not so much a place of unbearable human attrition as a stage upon which the leader demonstrates his virtue. How many unrecorded episodes lay under that bright surface? A mother stumbling as she tried to carry a child whose lips had already cracked past speech. A soldier abandoning his armour in a moment of desperate calculation, choosing weightless survival over honour, only to find that neither choice saved him. Arguments over who deserved the last mouthful from a nearly empty skin. These scenes did not make it into the histories we have, not because they were unimportant at the time, but because the people who lived them had no scribes standing nearby, no later biographers eager to search out their names. The silence is not only literary. Physical traces of the march are elusive too. Deserts can preserve, but they can also efface swiftly, burying footsteps, bleaching bones, scattering fragments far from where they fell. Archaeology along the Macedon coast and in adjacent inland corridors has uncovered signs of ancient routes, traces of settlements and way stations, but no definitive direct imprint that can be tied without question to this particular column of suffering humanity. We are left with a broad, plausible corridor and sparse, second-hand lines about what occurred within it. Alexander, in the stories that survive, emerges from Gedrosia gaunt but unbroken, his status strangely burnished by endurance. Some sources even suggest that he took a grim pride in having led his men through such trials, as if the cost in lives had been converted into a kind of existential currency, proof that he and those who survived were set apart from ordinary mortals. Yet such framing skirts a troubling edge. At what point does a leader's willingness to share hardship shade into indifference about how much hardship he is willing to impose? The numbers of dead are unknown. Ancient authors give no precise figures, just impressions of heavy loss. Modern estimates are necessarily speculative. Here, the machinery of historical reconstruction falters. We have troop counts for earlier battles, sometimes exaggerated but at least debated. For Gedrosia, we mostly have adjectives: many, terrible, great suffering. The absence of detail is not a minor inconvenience, it is the essence of the problem. Where the written record thins, entire human experiences vanish into a kind of conceptual haze, acknowledged but not truly seen. Some historians have argued that the Gedrosian march was partly motivated by punishment, that Alexander wished to chastise parts of his army, especially those who had resisted him at the Ephesus, by forcing them through an ordeal that would burn away reluctance. If this is even partly true, then the desert becomes not only a landscape but an instrument, a tool used consciously to reshape the emotional and political texture of his forces. Yet the texts we have do not unequivocally confirm this reading. They hint, suggest, leave gaps. The line between interpretation and speculation begins to blur. For the listener lying in the dark, another question arises, one that extends beyond this specific march. How many of the greatest traumas in human history have left only the faintest textual shadows, precisely because those who lived through them were the least able to write? Wars often generate chronicles, but famines, plagues, forced migrations, and annihilating journeys like Gedrosia's are harder to capture in neat narrative arcs. They shatter the social conditions that allow for careful writing, stability, surplus, a literate class with leisure. When everything is devoted to clinging to life, there is little space left for parchment and stylus. What survives are usually the remarks of outsiders, those who passed through or ruled over the catastrophe, rather than sinking fully into it. In Alexander's case, this means we largely see Gedrosia through the eyes of commanders and later biographers who were impressed by his endurance, chastened by the scale of loss, but ultimately committed to preserving his legend. They mark the suffering, then move on, to Carmania, to Susa, to Babylon. The dead remain behind, unnamed. Imagine instead a lost account written by an ordinary soldier or a camp follower, someone who had no reason to flatter the king. What would such a voice have said about the choice of route, about the distribution of resources, about the small injustices that accumulate when scarcity sharpens hierarchies? There is no trace of such a document. Perhaps it was never written. Perhaps if it was, it decayed in some forgotten archive, deemed too minor to recopi compared to more polished histories. Either way, its absence shapes the way we think, quietly narrowing the range of questions we ask. Gedrosia thus becomes a symbol not only of physical desolation, but of archival desolation. A place where memory itself runs dry. A vast, sandy corridor through which passed one of the most famous armies of antiquity, leaving behind almost nothing but a moralized anecdote and a vague admission of horror. The radiance of Alexander's campaigns before and after casts this interlude as a kind of necessary trial, even a crucible. But beneath that framing might lurk something simpler and starker, a miscalculation whose cost was borne by those whose names were never meant to be remembered. If this is true for an event tied to such a celebrated figure, what of all the forgotten marches, the unmarked exoduses, the caravans that never reached their oases? How many Gedrosian deserts lie scattered through history, invisible not because nothing happened there, but because too much happened to people who had no way to inscribe their pain into durable form. As the night deepens and breathing softens, another, more unsettling thought drifts in. When we praise the endurance of great leaders and speak of the lengths they went, how often are we standing unknowingly on the buried bones of those who stumbled behind them, dissolved into silence by the very absence of anyone left to write? By the time the long arc of marching, bleeding and burning had curved back toward Mesopotamia, something in the story had begun to sound like an echo of itself. Victories blurred together, titles accumulated, ceremonies layered upon old ceremonies. When Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BCE, it was not as the hungry young king of Macedon, but as a figure whose name already hung over half the known world like a weather system. And yet, in this place where rivers braided and empires had risen and fallen before him, his own line would suddenly snap, leaving behind one of the strangest gaps of all, a death with too many explanations and a body that would not stay in one clear place. Babylon, in the Greek and Near Eastern imagination, was a city of signs. Astronomers there had recorded eclipses and planetary movements on clay tablets for centuries, noting unusual events in the sky alongside changes in kings and wars on the ground. When Alexander entered the city, the local scholars watched him not only as a ruler but as an omen, a point of disturbance in the timeline. Some of the so-called astronomical diaries from Babylon survive, their wedge-shaped marks still pressed into clay, mentioning a foreign king, military movements, even disturbances in the temples. These are among the few near-contemporary records that brush against his life. They do not praise or condemn, they simply note. The literary sources, written much later, surround his final months there with a haze of portents. Plutarch and Arrian speak of unfavourable sacrifices, of birds behaving ominously, of a man sitting uninvited on Alexander's throne and then being executed as a bad sign. Others mention warnings from Babylonian priests about entering the city at all, urging him to avoid certain gates or routes. In some versions he ignores the cautions, in others he makes adjustments, as if trying to negotiate with destiny through alternate doorways. How much of this is memory, and how much is retrofitted drama, added by later authors who needed the end of such a life to feel properly foreshadowed? The more closely one looks, the more these omens resemble stage directions added after the play has closed, annotations in the margins of a script that had already been fully performed. What we do have that is unusually close to the events is a damaged fragmentary text sometimes called the Babylonian Diary of Alexander's Final Days. Preserved on clay and written in Akkadian, it seems to record in terse lines a king falling ill after inspecting flooded land or crossing canals, then growing weaker over several days. There are mentions of fever, of him being too sick to perform certain rituals, of officials consulting in his absence. The language is dry, almost bureaucratic. No poison, no drama, just illness threading its way through the body of a man whose name is never even spelled out in full. Against this stark minimalism, the Greek and Roman traditions overflow with detail. They describe Alexander attending a banquet at the house of Medius of Larissa, drinking deeply, perhaps already worn down by years of strain. Some accounts speak of a sudden pain after a cup of unmixed wine, a stabbing sensation in the back or side, followed by a decline. Others present a more gradual onset, days of fever during which he continued to give orders, to plan new campaigns, to listen to reports and respond with nods or gestures when speech failed. Poison appears in these narratives like a shadow that will not quite fade. Diodorus, Justin, and later writers repeat rumours of a conspiracy. Disgruntled officers, embittered companions, perhaps even men acting on behalf of Antipater, the old regent in Macedon, who feared being displaced. The poison is variously said to have been brought from distant sources, slipped into wine, hidden in a mule's hoof. Yet even ancient authors admit the story is shaky. Some reject it outright, noting that Alexander's illness lasted too long, more consistent with disease than with fast-acting venom. Modern medical speculation ranges from malaria to typhoid fever, from complications of wounds to the cumulative damage of alcohol and infection. Each proposal rests on reading symptoms from texts written by men who are not physicians and who shape their descriptions to fit narrative expectations. The result is a strange doubling. On one side, a short contemporary clay record muttering about fever and incapacity. On the other, a cluster of later literary portraits describing drinking parties, laments, last speeches, mysterious pains, and whispered accusations. Between them yawns a space that no certainty quite bridges. The listener in the dark might ask softly, if a death can be told in so many incompatible ways, what exactly are we mourning when we recite it? His final hours in the more elaborate accounts are crowded and oddly theatrical. Companions file past the bed, grasping his hand in silence because he can no longer speak. Others claim he managed one last crucial statement. Asked to whom he left his empire, one tradition has him rasp, "To the strongest," a phrase that has launched countless reflections on ambition and civil war. Another tradition says he named no single heir, only passing his signet ring to Perdiccas, a senior officer, as if delegating stewardship rather than sovereignty. Some versions even attach a cryptic remark about anticipating great funerary contests over his remains. It is difficult to escape the sense that later generations could not bear the idea of so large a figure slipping away without a line that matched his reputation. They therefore supplied one, a tight, grim aphorism that turns the messy reality of succession into a moral motto. Yet if he said nothing, or spoke words that were mundane, unfinished, or incoherent, those could easily have been pushed aside. History, or at least the literary version of it, does not always welcome an anticlimax. What followed his death is in some ways clearer and yet no less disturbing. There was no adult, legitimate son ready to take the throne. His half-brother Aridaeus, later called Philip III, was mentally impaired to an extent that made him a tool rather than a ruler. Roxana, the Sogdian wife, was pregnant. The question of who would inherit the empire was thus less about legal right and more about who could control these symbolic figures and mobilize armies in their names. The so-called Partition of Babylon, reconstructed from later accounts, shows generals carving territories for themselves while still professing loyalty to a shared royal house. The language of unity cloaked the reality of looming fragmentation. It is striking how quickly the narrative focus in our sources shifts from the dead king to the living contenders. Yet one element remains an object of fierce attention: his body. Ancient cultures often treated the corpse of a great ruler as more than a shell. It was a locus of legitimacy, a touchstone for rituals, a magnet for pilgrimage and display. According to some reports, Alexander's body was placed in a gold anthropoid coffin, immersed in honey or other preserving substances, and prepared for transport back to Macedon. The plan, at least on paper, was to bury him in the ancestral land, perhaps at Igi among the Argead tombs. But the corpse never arrived. Somewhere along the route, Ptolemy, who had secured control of Egypt, intercepted the funeral convoy. He diverted the body to Memphis first, then later to Alexandria, installing it as the sacred centerpiece of his own realm. The act was both pious and deeply political. To possess Alexander's remains was to anchor one's own claim to his legacy. It turned Egypt into more than a satrapy. It became the guardian of the conqueror's afterimage. For centuries afterward, ancient writers reported that Alexander's tomb, his soma, could be visited in Alexandria. Strabo, writing in the early Roman period, describes the city and notes that the Ptolemies had transferred the body there. Later anecdotes claim that Julius Caesar, then Augustus, sought out the tomb, that one of them viewed the mummified remains, possibly touching the body or accidentally damaging it. Whether these stories are literal or partly symbolic, they show that, at least for a time, his grave was not simply a hidden resting place, but part of the city's political and spiritual stage. And then, at some point in late antiquity, the trail goes cold. References to the tomb grow vague, then vanish. Earthquakes, riots, religious transformations, changes in urban topography, all could have contributed to the disappearance. Alexandria itself suffered assaults from time, war, and the sea. Modern excavations in the city have uncovered layers of Hellenistic, Roman, and later remains, but no definitive, universally accepted tomb of Alexander. scholars and enthusiasts have proposed locations all over the map, under modern streets, beneath later churches, in the royal quarter lost to the harbour, even in more distant shrines. None of these hypotheses has achieved consensus. The result is that one of history's most famous bodies hovers in a kind of archival limbo. We're told it once lay in a golden coffin, then in a glass one, then under stone. We are told that powerful men stood before it, that crowds approached it with awe. Yet today there is no confirmed sarcophagus to point to, no bones that can be quietly measured, tested, and placed back into the ground. For a figure whose life has been over-described, his physical remains have become underlocated, a rumour more than a relic. There is something symbolically apt about this vanishing. A man whose story absorbed and effaced so many other histories leaves behind no agreed place where his own story comes to rest. Instead, his name circulates through texts, through statues and coins, through the shifting arguments of historians unattached to any certain grave. The earth, at least in this case, refuses to provide the comforting closure of a known tomb. In that refusal, unintentional as it may be, another question starts to glow faintly in the darkness. When a life has been so thoroughly claimed, polished, and used by the narratives of empires, is it an accident that the one indisputable piece of evidence that he existed as fragile flesh and bone has slipped from view? Or is there a deeper pattern in the way the ground itself seems to conspire with time to keep us from ever quite finding where, exactly, Alexander finally lay? After the fever in Babylon, after the honeyed coffin and the diverted funeral cart, after the golden sarcophagus that may or may not have glimmered in lamplight beneath Alexandrian ceilings, the man himself recedes. What remains, spreading quietly through centuries, is something both softer and more resilient, a pattern of stories attaching and reattaching to his name, like climbing vines around the absent trunk of a tree. If his body became untraceable, his image did the opposite, multiplying, adapting, slipping into languages and faith that had never seen his face. In the Greek and Roman worlds, he was never truly allowed to die. Philosophers and statesmen stocked their minds with anecdotes about him, as if they were coins of moral currency. The water poured out in the desert, the respect for Porus, the taming of Bucephalus, the hunger that made him despair that his father would leave him nothing to conquer. Roman generals slept with his histories under their pillows, walked his battlefields, compared themselves to him, and always found the comparison useful, whether to praise or to warn. Caesar is said to have wept at the statue of Alexander in Gades, feeling himself small by comparison. Whether that scene unfolded exactly as later writers claimed hardly matters. The image persisted because it suited the needs of people who wished to measure their own ambitions against something safely distant. Then, in the unpredictable way that stories travel, Alexander became something else entirely in other traditions. In parts of the Islamic world and in Persian literature, he appears as Iskandar or as Du al-Qarnayn, the two-horned one. In the Quran, Du al-Qarnayn is a figure who journeys to the ends of the earth, reaching the place where the sun sets in a murky spring, the place where it rises upon a people barely shielded from its rays, and finally a northern region where he builds a great barrier against destructive tribes known as Gog and Magog. The text is sparse, suggestive. It does not name Alexander directly. Yet for centuries, commentators, storytellers, and poets wove connections between this enigmatic traveller and the Macedonian king. Why him? In part because his reputation as a world-circling conqueror fit the frame, a man touching multiple horizons, moving between peoples, making and unmaking boundaries. In Persian and Central Asian adaptations of the Alexander romance, Iskandar becomes at times a seeker of wisdom, at times an unwitting instrument of divine plans, at times a tragic figure whose conquests are folded into a larger cycle of rise and fall. He meets philosophers, prophets, strange nations. He searches not only for lands but for the water of life and fails to find it. The conqueror who could not be stopped by walls and rivers is here gently humbled by more subtle forms of limit. In Armenian, Syriac, Ethiopic and other versions, the tale stretches further, absorbing local motifs, theological concerns, cosmological diagrams. Alexander becomes a builder of gates against chaos, a visitor to the realm of darkness, a listener to talking creatures and enchanted trees. He is sometimes presented as an ally of the true faith of the moment, sometimes as a figure in need of correction by wiser voices. Each tradition writes over the previous, not necessarily with malice, but with the quiet insistence that stories must serve the living. The so-called Alexander romance itself, a loose cycle of narratives that probably began in Hellenistic times and expanded for centuries, is one of the clearest examples of this gradual transformation. It mixes scraps of history with wild inventions. Alexander descending into the sea in a glass diving bell, flying through the air in a basket borne by griffins, conversing with the Amazons, encountering monstrous races. Scholars, tracing these layers, can sometimes glimpse how political needs, religious debates, and simple curiosity press themselves into the clay of the legend. Yet for the ordinary reader or listener in late antiquity or the medieval world, these distinctions between fact and fiction were hardly the point. What mattered was that the name Alexander had become a vessel into which almost any meaning could be poured. It is tempting to stand far away from this process, in the comfort of modern categories, and declare where the true Alexander ends and the false one begins. Historians draw firm lines around what the earliest, most sober sources attest, then label the rest as accretion. But even that earlier core, as we have seen, is already mediated, chosen, translated, often designed to instruct or inspire. The real Alexander is not a stable figure waiting to be revealed once the husks of legend are peeled away. He is already a kind of palimpsest, earlier writings scraped and overwritten, still faintly visible beneath newer ink. Over time, the uses to which he was put multiplied. For some, he became a model of enlightened conquest, a king who respected local customs and sought to merge peoples. For others, he was a cautionary tale about hubris, a man who flew too close to the edge of the world and was called back by sudden death. National traditions alternately claimed and rejected him, a Greek hero, a Macedonian icon, a foreign invader, a semi-legendary ancestor, a symbol of unity or of oppression. The same name, turned at different angles, throws different shadows. Behind these fluctuations lies a simple mechanism that is anything but simple to resist. Power tends to appropriate stories that work. A ruler who wishes to present himself as a bridge between cultures may invoke Alexander's imagined policy of intermarriage and fusion. A general who values relentless ambition may highlight the tireless march, the refusal to stop at any river until the hyphasis forced his hand. Each chooses the scene that flatters the desired self-image. The cost of this selection is rarely counted. For every anecdote elevated into a moral emblem, tens of thousands of lived moments fall away, unremembered. As empires waned and new faiths redrew the map of meaning, some images of Alexander became awkward, then dangerous. Early Christian writers, for example, sometimes admired his courage while criticizing his pride, seeing in his brief flaring life a reminder that kingdoms of this world are fragile. In other contexts, especially where Greek paganism was receding, too much admiration for old conquerors could look like nostalgia for a rejected order. Stories were trimmed, reinterpreted, or allowed to drift into the realm of harmless romance, suitable for fireside entertainment rather than serious imitation. Meanwhile, in regions he had once crossed with blood and fire, local memories adapted in quieter ways. In parts of Central and South Asia, faint echoes of his march survive in place names, in loosely connected legends, in genealogies that claim descent from his soldiers or from semi-mythical companions. Often, these claims tell us more about later communities' need for prestigious origins than about any continuous precise memory. But they also reveal something else, that even the trauma of invasion can, with enough centuries, be folded into origin myths, softened into stories of encounter rather than annihilation. The modern age, with its critical apparatus, its stratified archives, its analytics of empire, might appear to stand apart from all this. Biographies of Alexander today often carry notes, citations, footnoted debates over source reliability. Archaeology and numismatics check the exaggerations of ancient authors. Comparative studies bring in Babylonian, Egyptian, and other fragments. Yet even now the desire to see in him what we most fear or desire persists. He becomes, in different hands, the prototype of charismatic leadership, the symbol of toxic expansionism, the experimenter in multicultural governance, the restless youth trapped in a too-small world. And beneath that restless recycling, a larger unease stirs. If one man's life can be bent so easily to so many purposes, what does that say about our broader relationship to the past? Each era, each regime, each community seems to assemble its own museum of history, selecting exhibits that support its preferred stories and placing others in storage, sometimes forever. Archives are curated spaces, not neutral mirrors. Curricula are crafted, not discovered. To include is to exclude by implication. Alexander's afterlives simply make this process unusually visible. His name is bright enough that we can watch it being reused. For countless others, whose fame never reached such a pitch, the rewritings happened more quietly, leaving little trace. The victors wrote the chronicles, the defeated were reduced to footnotes, then to silence. Occasionally, archaeology or a rediscovered manuscript cracks open a small window, showing that what we took for the whole sky was only a ceiling. More often, the gaps remain gaps. The listener lying in the dark, following this long, wavering thread from a shadowy boy in Macedon to a missing tomb and a legend dispersed across continents, might feel a subtle shift in perspective. The question is no longer only, who was Alexander really, but something colder, more encompassing. What does it mean that even about him, with all his noise and monuments, we have to guess so much? And if that is true here, what has happened to everyone else? Some nights one might imagine the unwritten histories gathering at the edges of our inherited stories like a low, patient tide. The missing Persian chronicles, the burned tablets of Persepolis, the unwritten laments of Gedrosian marchers, the unrecorded words of those who met him in marketplaces and did not find him divine at all. They do not shout. They press softly against the neat lines of the narratives we repeat, like water against an old, hairline-cracked wall. One day, perhaps, more fragments will surface. A tablet pulled from the ground, a hoard of letters, an inscription on a forgotten stone. They may shift a few details, alter a few emphases, suggest that we have misunderstood this or that decision. But the deeper pattern will remain. As long as stories are told by the living, they will bend around the needs of the moment, turning people into symbols, turning complexity into parable. Somewhere, in an unmarked place under layers of earth and construction and silt, a handful of bones once belonged to the man called Alexander. Somewhere, in rooms of paper and light, his name continues to move, rearranging itself in new sentences, new theories, new uses. Between those two poles, the absent skeleton and the ever-changing text, A narrow, uneasy path stretches into the dark, and along that path, just beyond the edge of certainty, a question waits like a figure half seen. When the time comes for our own age to be remembered or forgotten, who will decide which of our stories deserve to survive, and how different will their version of us be from the one we whisper to ourselves now, alone, just before sleep?